The evolution of historically black colleges and universities is the subject of a new documentary on PBS. Tell Them We Are Rising is the brainchild of Stanley Nelson, one of the most important and award-winning filmmakers of our time. Today, a standing room only crowd is getting a sneak preview of this film on the campus of Jackson State University. That's where we are too, and we're honored to be joined by the man himself. Stanley, welcome to Jackson, Mississippi.
Thank you so much.
I got to tell you, a lot of times on a documentary, you hope you learn something, but what's so great about this one, and I really thought it's fantastic, what's so great about it is that it reteaches you things you already thought you knew. And why did you decide to tell this story now?
Well, you know, the now is an interesting part because we probably started the film about 10 years ago. We first started thinking about it. So, you know, when we started making the film, or started trying to raise money to make the film, we knew that it was one of those things that you call an evergreen film, that, you know, anytime we could ever get it done, it still would have a meaning.
Right.
But, you know, I think it has more meaning now because, you know, we were in a place, you know, just a few short years ago where we were talking about a post-racial society.
Right.
That's not something we talk about anymore.
We were talking a little bit before about Morris Brown in Atlanta and what's happened with that college. Why is this story so important today?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, one is obviously there so many of the schools are facing a crisis, you know, because of money, of funding, and that's a crisis. You know, but also some of the schools are doing really well. Some of the schools in the last 2 years have seen an uptick, an increase in applications, you know, partially because of what they call the Missouri effect. You know, there was, demonstrations at the University of Missouri, and I think that you know, young African Americans are many, you know, are looking for this place where, you know, maybe race doesn't matter for 4 years of your life. You know, maybe there's actually a place where race doesn't matter in the United States.
But that's kind of a golden thread throughout the whole film. It's like that these colleges have been kind of a safe place for great things to develop. I mean, you think about the civil rights movement, that developed out of historically black colleges and universities.
You know, the sit-in movements that like spread throughout the South, basically through black colleges, came because four students at North Carolina A&T were sitting around and said, you know, this is crazy that we can't eat at Woolworths. Let's just go down and sit in. And that's what they did. Now, that's not going to happen at Harvard or Yale or any place else like that.
There's one scene in there that really honestly made me laugh, as one of the protesters said, when I finally did sit down and have the meal, it was the worst meal I'd ever had. That was great. Yeah,
no, that's a great moment. I mean, one of the things that we always do when we're making films, you know, these kind of very deep and serious films, is hold on to any humor. You know, anything that's like halfway funny, you know, we don't cut that. We just try to keep making that work, keeping that in until the last moment, because, you know, that's one of my barometers. You know, when we have a screening, I'll kind of be listening outside and, you know, and just make sure that people laugh at that moment, because, you know, that always gets a laugh.
Because it balances out. I mean, you have a really powerful scene of a professor writing his wife and his family goodbye when he knows he's about to get lynched.
Yeah, that's just an amazing story that happened in the 1890s, where a white professor had traveled to the South to teach African Americans, and they basically capture him and tell him they're going to lynch him, and they give him a chance to write a letter home, and he writes a letter that starts with, you know, "My dear, I died tonight." And he actually did die.
Wow. Yeah, my great-great-grandfather was a Methodist circuit rider in Mississippi, and there was one night he had to get on the train and get to Memphis before he ended up that same fate. So,
So sometimes we forget how, you know, how precarious education was, you know, back then, and that I think so much is in the film that, you know, over 20,000 people were killed, you know, for education. Back then in the late 19th century.
That's what really struck me about the film, and it reminded me, and it's something that I've let my sons watch it with me as we were doing it. They're 17 and 15. And I said, you need to understand something, the power of an education. And you really start right during slavery, when it was against the law to teach slaves, because I think the white class knew that this is not something we want to happen because we lose power.
Yeah, I mean, it was really important for me to start the film during the time of enslavement, to start back there, because that's where you see how important education is. The fact that it was illegal for African Americans to learn to read and write, to be educated, and as somebody says in the film, you know, it was also illegal for white folks, you know, masters to teach their own slaves to read and write. So that was how much education was feared throughout the slaveholding South.
And it also reminded me too that if you don't have something, it's something you truly desire. It's like when you're thirsty, how much you really want water. Right. Because I mean, you have these great quotes from people saying, "I want to learn." Right.
One thing, you know, that this film made me think about is I mean, if you stop and think about it and say, okay, look, I'm enslaved. Yeah. I'm on a plantation, right? I might be the third or fourth generation that's been enslaved. Right? All I know is this plantation. I don't know that there's an Africa. I don't know that there's a Europe. I don't know that there's a China. I don't know anything except what I'm told. You know, because I can't read, I can't write. Nobody I know can read and write. I mean, it's an amazing thing when you start thinking about it in that way.
It's almost like, I guess, when they started printing the Bible in the vernacular, and when people could start reading it themselves, suddenly the power goes into the hands of the people.
Right, right. And as you say, I think that you know that reading and writing and education was looked at like this holy grail. So that, you know, soon as the Civil War ended, that's when the schools start popping up. So in the last couple of years and in the couple of years to come, we see all these anniversaries, 150th anniversaries of these schools, because they started 1865, 1866, 1867, right after the Civil War.
Several of them here in Mississippi, as a matter of fact. And it's so, even though the Civil War ended and slavery technically ended, the mindset did not end. No. You know, it was so difficult. It just depended who was controlling the schools and what kind of education that people were going to get.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of our next stories is about, you know, Booker T. Washington and the idea of an industrial education, which kind of swept through the South, which the idea was that really that we will educate people just enough for servitude.
His story shocked me a little bit, to be honest. Of course, I grew up in Georgia in the 1970s, so my textbooks were probably, they kind of painted him as a little bit more of a hero than maybe the documentary does. And I don't think he was necessarily a bad guy. You know, you start off his story, he's excited about getting an education himself. He gets hooked up with Samuel Armstrong, who's, of course, the head of the university, and he kind of suddenly thinks that, you know, maybe African Americans don't need to become lawyers and doctors. They need to get that. And it kind of painted Booker T. Washington a little bit differently than maybe I had learned about.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we get a lot at screenings. You know, people are like kind of shocked at looking at Booker T. Washington that way. But that's who he was, you know, and I think it doesn't matter if you have good intentions, you know. I think there's very few people who are evil, who think, oh, I'm doing evil. I mean, he
caused damage.
You know, he thought he was doing good. As someone says, he really caused damage, and he was very dangerous. You know, the idea was that his idea was that black people should be educated for servitude. Right. That black people weren't ready. He has a famous story that's actually not in the film, where, you know, he's riding down the road and he sees this little kid, you know, outside a shack, and he's reading, you know, Shakespeare or something. Yeah. And the way he took that was like, why does this kid need to be doing, this kid is totally wasting his time. Right. He has no use for Shakespeare. He should be reading a manual on how to lay bricks or something. And that's what Booker T. Washington really espoused.
But you hear that same argument with education today too.
Not out in the open.
Not out in the open, no, but I mean, you do. You hear some people saying, well, you know, people don't need to go to college. They need to just learn a trade.
Right, and I think that, look, people do need to learn trades, and I would not argue with that at all. The problem was,
I wish I'd learned a trade.
The problem was that Booker T. Washington played in to what the Southern planter elite wanted and what the Northern industrialists wanted. The Northern industrialists, they wanted a workforce, but they wanted a workforce that was educated, and as somebody says in the film, not too educated. So you had to read the sign that said explosives, you know, or do not enter. You know, you had to be able to read that. But you know, they didn't want them pushing for equality, pushing for unionization, all those kind of things. So, you know, I think by and large, you know, when you add it all up, it's a very dangerous philosophy that Booker T. Washington had.
Really, his polar opposite was W.E.B. Du Bois, who really, I mean, I'm sitting there reading and listening to his remarks and reading about him, thinking, you know what, he was like 150 years ahead of his time.
Yeah, well, Du Bois was like one of the most amazing,
intelligent men ever.
Right, one of the most amazing people ever on earth. I mean, as somebody says in the film, he might have been the most educated person, black or white, in the United States. I mean, he had gone to Fisk, he had gone to Harvard, then he had gone to Germany for further studies. I mean, he was the man, and he gets into the debate with Booker T and says, well, no, wait a minute. Black people need to be educated just as white people are. They need to, learn Greek and Latin and history and all those things. And they get into this kind of pitched battle. Fortunately, W.B. Du Bois holds sway and, changes the course of our history.
As the 20th century began, it's like Booker T. Washington's kind of mindset kind of faded. And I love, there's a great story, I think, that his daughter, Yolanda, from Fisk University, kind of reported on some things that were going on thanks to President McKenzie. That one's like, okay, you got to tell that story.
Yeah, that's a great story. So this is in the mid-20s, 1920s, and Du Bois's daughter is going to Fisk, and we tell the story of Fisk University that had a white president. Most of the black colleges up until the 20s and on had white presidents, and so they have a white president, a guy named McKenzie, who knows nothing about black folks. He knows nothing, as someone says in the film. His secretary says he doesn't even like black people really. And so he's the president, and he institutes all these draconian measures. Like men and women can't walk together. Yeah. He cancels the baseball team, the football team, the sororities, the fraternities. He doesn't want black people to kind of be together in any way. And the students invite at the same time. They invite Du Bois to be their commencement speaker. And so W.B. Du Bois goes as a commencement speaker, and instead of saying, go out and go forth and conquer, he gets up and his first words are, I have not come, I've come here to criticize. Right. I have not come here to be nice. And he gives this rousing speech, and the students then basically leave the hall and start a riot. And they go on strike, and McKenzie finally has to resign.
They were ahead of their time, too. The students were, but they stood up and for the change, and they got that. Wasn't he like head of Indian Affairs or something like that?
Yeah, he had been head of Indian Affairs out west, and they said, oh well, he knows about Indians, so I guess he knows about black people. So let's make a good president.
I like in his letter he said he was going to go study racial affairs and sociology or something like that.
That's another one of those instances where it was this funny thing where he says, I'm going to retire, but I'm looking for a job in race relations or something. That was actually his resignation letter that he sends to one of his friends.
There was a part about World War I, and I think about World War II, like with Medgar Evers when he came home, and that was what really fueled him to make the changes here. I never really thought about World War I, but World War I really was a turning point. I guess you go fight for the freedom of your country. You kind of like to have that freedom when you get home.
Yeah, and I think once again, you had African American soldiers. They go overseas, they go to Europe, and they see a whole different way of looking at life. Of course, we're not gonna say that Europe was perfect, but it wasn't the Jim Crow South, and they're accepted in a different way. But also, in World War I and World War II, the African American soldiers come in as liberators. Yeah. So the people are like, whoa, and then they come home. And they were, beaten and lynched just because they had a uniform on. Right. So they would get off of the train at a station, with their army uniform on, off at a station in the South, and they would just be beaten down. It would be like, wait, who do you think you are wearing the uniform of the United States? Right. We are going to put you back in your place immediately. And there were riots all over what was called the Red Summer.
I got to interview Dennis and Vernon Damer, and of course, the shooting and their father losing his life, and there was that iconic photograph of them standing in front of the burned out shell of their home, all wearing their uniforms in the country. That's what that reminded me of there. Here you fight for your country, you wear the uniform, and you come home and you can't enjoy the rights. Right. Very powerful.
I mean, and what always amazes me about it is that a lot of these incidents happened simply because you had on the uniform.
Right.
I mean, having on the uniform was what it was. That's what sent people into a frenzy.
Right. You talked a little bit earlier about, and I think one of the threads too is who controls the education, how important that is. And you know, I think sometimes when humanity truly goes bad is when one group thinks they're better than the other. And even when you had well-meaning people that were in charge of the schools and the education, if they thought, you know, they carried that mindset from slavery days and they thought that maybe black people were inferior, that kind of meant an inferior education. That really changed, and I was really impressed with Charles Hamilton Houston when he came into Howard.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories, and you know, when I talk about it, a lot of times I just get teary-eyed because it's just so crazy. We call that chapter an audacious plan. It's a mouthful, but it's an audacious plan. The idea, you know, Charles Hamilton Houston is appointed the head of Howard Law School. Charles Hamilton Houston was a Harvard lawyer. He had been trained at Harvard. He's appointed at Howard. Howard's law school is unaccredited. It's a night school. It's a crappy law school, you know, by any measure. It's not a good law school. And he's appointed head of it, and he says, you know, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna make this a first-rate law school. Then I'm gonna train a group of civil rights lawyers, and then they're gonna go and they're gonna sue the government and say that Jim Crow, that segregation is not constitutional, and we're going to win, and we're going to change the whole course of the United States. And it's crazy, but he does it, you know, and it takes like over 20 years to do this, to improve the law school, to train this group of lawyers, Thurgood Marshall as one of them,
Yes.
then to build case by case by case across the South, and then go with Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954 and sue the Supreme Court and say, you know, segregation in and of itself is equal. I mean, he does this with these lawyers that he's trained at this crappy law school, that he's now risen to the heights of being able to change this law. It's just an amazing, amazing story. And it is an audacious plan.
Right.
I mean, who could think of something like that?
And I love his incredibly high standards, like Thurgood Marshall saying, you know, hey, he said at one point, you look on either side of you, those people will not be there.
Right. I don't think this is in the film because we just didn't have this figure, but I think there were 36 people in Thurgood Marshall's class, and I think 9 graduated.
Wow. It's almost like the Navy SEALs.
Yeah.
Really is.
Yeah, it's rough.
Well, you know, and of course, he and Thurgood Marshall toured the South, and Houston was a technology nut, so he has a camera. And he's taking pictures and motion pictures of the African American experience, and you have some of that in the film. It's just so powerful.
Yeah, they just took such beautiful pictures, and they actually traveled. He and Thurgood Marshall traveled through the South, and they took movies. I mean, that actually is my favorite moment in the film because the guy, you know, it's like when you're interviewing somebody and they just deliver the line, and he says, you know, they went through the South, and in his back of his car, he had a camera, he had a typewriter, and he had a movie camera. And we cut to the film that they shot, which is just amazing. You know, they have shots of the white kids, you know, all dressed up, getting on the school bus to go to school, and then the black kids running down, you know, this dirt road with no shoes on, going to these schools that, you know, you can't even believe it when you see it. I mean, they look like, you know, it looks like somebody's 200-year-old shack that you know they moved into and tried to have school. Some of the students are learning outside. You know, they're like sitting outside learning. You know, that was something that was really influential in being able to show people, you know, this is what is being called separate but equal.
Right.
You know, here's the evidence. You know, here it is.
And he knew that if he even went after the states on separate but equal, if they even tried to make it equal, they couldn't do that.
Right. I mean, his audacious plan was basically to say to the southern states, okay, you know, you want to have separate but equal, that's fine. You know, we're not going to argue that anymore because we've been arguing that for 50 years and it hasn't worked. Okay, so here's what we'll do. We won't argue that. We'll say, yes, that's a great idea. Do separate but equal. Okay, but just make these things equal. But states could not do that. That was impossible to do because the only way the system worked was for it to be separate and unequal because you didn't have the money to make both things equal.
Right, and some of the examples of how they were trying to make it equal was just ridiculous. The poor guy in Oklahoma.
Yeah, that's a great story. So a guy, he's actually an older black man who wants to go back to college and get an advanced degree. And so in the middle of these suits that Charles Hamilton Houston is instituting, they they kind of let him in. They let him in the University of Oklahoma. They let him in, but they won't let him sit in the classroom. So there's great pictures. So they actually took pictures because, you know, it became a news story. So he's like sitting outside the classroom, you know, in a desk outside the classroom. And here's the classroom here. He's like looking through the doorway. You know, it was crazy. I mean, you know, we didn't have the footage. I mean, there was no pictures of this, but they actually made him, they put like towels around him at lunch so that he ate lunch by himself. You know, it was just nuts.
Wow. One of the things, and I love you've got the example of people getting married and meeting people, and you know, you think about, I guess during the 50s and 60s, what 97% of African Americans went to, you know, historically black colleges and universities, but you don't realize what a difference it made for society, for the black middle class. It created the black middle class, all these marriages and everything else, and I just love that. I just think the stories are so. That's one of those moments too, where you're going through all this really dark moment, and then you just feel like,
I mean, we it was so great. We found this couple who were in their 90s, and they tell the story, and they're just really funny, and they tell the story about how they met, you know, and at a college, which is like a hilarious story, and then, you know, it ends where the guy says, you know, like 68 years today we were, you know, married, and so, you know, they met at a black college. So, but you know, that's what college is. That's how people meet. You know, black colleges were this engine to push people into the black middle class. That's what they did.
Well, they changed your family tree. I mean, your parents went to black colleges and are incredibly talented and gifted as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, my father and his brother were the first people in his family to graduate high school.
Wow.
My father would have never gone to college. My father wasn't even thinking about going to college. My father got out of high school and had a dead-end job in Washington, D.C., and you know, was miserable, and his friends came to him and said, you know, you should go to Howard. Yeah. We're going to Howard. You know, you could go to Howard. You can do the work. It's not above you. You can do it. You know, it's a nurturing atmosphere, and there's a lot of pretty girls. And you should go to Howard, and that's what my father did.
And he heard the last part, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. No, my father. That's what. It
would have got my attention.
It doesn't matter, you know. Whatever he heard, it got him to Howard, you know, and it changed his life.
And so, therefore, they made sure that you and your brothers and sisters had a good education.
That was big for them, yeah.
Yeah, it really was.
Really huge.
Speaking of Howard, the title of the film comes from a question asked by O.O. Howard.
Right. Yeah. That was something that, you know, in researching, we found this great story where O.O. Howard goes down south right after the Civil War, and kind of a tour of what's going on in the South, and he meets with a group of black students, and he says, well, what should I tell them when I go back north? And this young guy raises his hand and says, tell them we are rising. And when we heard that story, we were like, okay, this is it. You know, this is the title of the film. All we have to do is have the author, who has it in his book, retell that story, you know, on film, so we can use it in the film, so you'll understand why we did it. And he did, and it worked. It worked
perfectly. You know, you go the Southern and the tragedy happened there, but then you kind of transition to today. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about today, and as we wrap up. What do you think the future is for historically black colleges and universities?
I mean, I think the future is going to be okay. You know, I think the future is going to be okay. I mean, I think that, again, there's many schools that are seeing an uptick in applications. You know, if you look, you know, 30 years down the line, I'm sure there are schools that are going to fold, and maybe schools will combine, you know, and become one institution. Some schools are having a much greater Latino population. Yeah. Some schools are turning white. You know, some of the public schools, you know, are turning white. But I think they'll be okay. I mean, you know, I think until, you know, racism in this country ends, you know, you're going to need this safe intellectual space that black colleges provide. And I think that, you know, it seems that we're going the other way at this moment. You know, it's not like, oh, all of a sudden, we were living in this post-racial society, everything's good, no, I don't think anybody sane thinks that now.
Now you turn on the news now and you just cringe.
Yeah, so I think, you know, we need that. We need that kind of safe intellectual space that black colleges provide. You know, a place for young African Americans, if they so choose. Yes. They have a place where, you know, they're not judged constantly by the color of their skin, at least for 4 years.
Right. What were you working on next?
Well, you know, this is part of a trilogy. So we did a film called The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, We did Tell Them We Are Rising, and then we're doing a 4-hour series on the slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade and kind of the business of slavery, and looking at it, in kind of all its globalness, and so we're just starting that, and we're really excited about that.
Of course, you're a writer, director, producer, everything.
I have a lot of help. We have co-producers and co-writers. And
you even had
things.
students shooting footage. I love that.
Yeah, that was great. That was one of the great things about Tell Them We Are Rising is we worked with a number of black colleges across the country and had them, send us footage. And it was great because they would send us footage and we'd say, okay, well, this time shoot it without the lens cap. Take the lens cap off and shoot it. Okay, now this time maybe you should put it on a tripod, and that stuff. But they got better, and so when there's certain scenes like we have a kind of a montage of graduations at the end, and so we have 10 different schools graduating, which we couldn't have gone to 10 different places, and we just don't have the resources. And we have another montage of people moving in, so we had them shooting move-in day at a bunch of different schools, and so it was great. It was a great opportunity for them and great for us.
Yeah, it's great though. But I mean, 2 decades into your career, that was how you got started too, was getting to learn like that. So.
Yeah, you've got to start somewhere,
Exactly.
So it's great.
Look, we've unfortunately run out of time. I could do this all day, but I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for coming in, and congratulations on an amazing career so far.
Oh, thank you so much.